Okay guys, so now that we've talked about all the tools and equipment that we need, we're now going to get into tracing some of our designs. So we're going to start off by grabbing one of our design sheets, and we're going to be tracing this section here for starters, because what I'm going to be showing you is a bit of wool reverse applique. So we're going to trace onto some template paper. And the reason I like to use template paper is that it's easier then to trace around a template onto your freezer paper. So using our mechanical pencil, we're just going to follow that line, and you can see that you don't need the light box at this stage because it's quite easy to see through the template paper. Now this is really easy to cut too, just using your sharp scissors. So we're just going to trace around the design. Now normally, whoops, made a bit of a mistake there. Normally, when you've only got a couple of shapes, it's not necessary that you do use the paper, but it does come in handy. When you're tracing lots of leaves, it certainly does. So round we go. Now we're also going to trace this little section here that you see. Now this is the hole that we're going to cut out in our wool to do the reverse applique. So trace that section as well. Right down to the point. And then we're going to grab our scissors. We're going to cut this template out on the drawn line. You see it's fairly easy to cut. Round up the other side. So now we're ready to trace around that shape onto our freezer paper. So I'll just grab the freezer paper here. Now I don't know if I mentioned before, there was a dull side and a shiny side. So the dull side is the side that we trace onto, and the shiny side is the side that we iron onto our woven wool. So place it down there. Just click your pencil up, trace around the edge. You can see it's so much easier to trace around a shape than it is to trace off a design sheet. So around, all the way around, down the bottom. You have to do a little bit of twisting and turning sometimes. Oops, it does tend to slip a little bit, just reposition it. Round down here, whoops. Now we're also going to trace the inside edge of this cutout as well. Okie dokes. So now we grab our scissors and we just have to cut this shape out just outside of the drawn line, just really roughly. It doesn't have to be perfect. So you can see how I'm just cutting it really rough. And we're going to iron that onto our woven wool. Okay, so we're just going to grab our woven wool now and iron this shape onto the wool. Now this is the lovely penny rose wool that I talked to you about earlier. Now you'll see that it's got two sides. It's got a rib side and it's got a flat side. I always like to iron my wool onto the rib side because I like the flat side to be showing up on my work. So using a dry iron. Now the reason I like to use a dry iron as opposed to steam, when I use a steam iron, the moisture from the steam tends to make the freezer paper lift. So I opt for a dry iron all the time. So just give it a good press until it is well stuck. That seems, might give it a little bit of a dab again down the bottom. Now rather than deal with this whole big piece of wool in my hand like that, I'll just roughly cut around that shape. Now you could do this with your rotary cutter if you wanted to, just to save a little bit of time, but by doing so you also waste a little bit more wool too. So just pop that aside. So now I'm going to cut on that drawn line. Not a very good drawn line, I might add, but I'm going to cut on that drawn line. I always like to cut the centrepiece out of reverse applique first. So if you cut very carefully when you're doing reverse applique and pierce on the drawn line, you can actually use that teardrop shape that's going to come out of there for another project later on. So we'll pierce down, just like we did with our template paper, a couple of little snips to get you started. Then when you get going, start snipping all the way around. Now you'll see I open up my scissors quite a way and I rotate my work as I cut. And what this does is give you that nice smooth curve. Now if your freezer paper does happen to lift a little when you're cutting, it's always a good idea just to give it another dab with the iron, because it's easier to cut with your freezer paper sitting on your wool than it is flapping around in the breeze. Okay, seems to be okay, so we'll continue on. See what I mean about that extra shape that we just got? So we're able to use that later on in another project if we want to. So start cutting from the bottom here. So we're basically doing what we just did before with the template paper, cutting on that drawn line. Reverse applique is really fun because what you can do is you can pop a piece of contrasting cotton fabric or a piece of wool behind that cutout, and it just gives it another dimension. And if you've got a piece of cotton fabric that has some flowers or little circles or something on it, you can do a little bit of fussy cutting and position that opening over one of those shapes, and can look really fun. Okay, so you can see how I'm moving that around in my hand to get those nice smooth curves. And if you happen to get a few little nicks in your wool where you haven't got such a smooth curve, when you take that freezer paper off, you can just sort of fix them up with your scissors if you've got a good pair of sharp scissors, and just neaten it up a bit. So spinning it around. There's my badly drawn line from before. Okie dokes. So there it is. So that's what we've done. We've cut out on the drawn line and we've got our shape in the centre also cut out. So what we're going to do now is peel our freezer paper away. Now freezer paper doesn't leave any sticky residue like a fusible web does. So it's really just used for getting your shape from the design sheet onto your wool. So we're going to now pop a piece of fabric behind that shape. I've got some over here. Now you can see when you're using, say, this floral fabric, you can, if you position this shape over one of those flowers, it's like doing fussy cutting. We could move it up. We could perhaps turn it this way and have just that section showing. So it's fun what you can do if you've got a fun piece of fabric. So we're going to use the sandpaper board, which I talked about earlier. And the reason I like to use a sandpaper board is that it grips the wool when you're putting the glue on your background. And I'll demonstrate that now. If you can see here how I'm applying the glue, the sandpaper board is actually gripping the wool. If I was to do that on this background here on the board, see what happens? So if you've got a sandpaper board, it will help you a long way. I didn't actually need to put that bit of glue on the stem actually. I just need to put enough glue around the edge of this opening to sit on the cotton. Now what we're going to do now is position that opening over that flower. Now I think that looks pretty there. Now you'll see that I've cut that cotton bigger than that shape. It's easier to cut a rectangle piece and place it behind that opening than it is to cut a teardrop shape, Because what happens, and it's happened to me before, I've cut a shape out in the cotton of the teardrop shape, and when I've been stitching around, I've got around, started stitching here, and I've got around to the other side here, and it's actually moved a little bit, and I've ended up with a hole. So it actually is worthwhile cutting a bigger shape, and then you've got a few more options too with fussy cutting. Okay, so now that I think that that looks pleasing to my eye, I'm going to grab my stapler, because I like to use staples rather than pins. Make sure I've got staples in there. And what I'm going to do is just put a few staples in around the edge here. Now, even though I've used the glue, the staples are going to give it a really firm hold. So off I go, just a couple. Now the wool's self-healing, so the staples aren't going to damage your wool. One of the other reasons I like to use a stapler is because if I'm away travelling but I want to take some hand sewing with me, if it's got pins sort of get caught up with everything else, the staples will hold it really firmly in place and I'm not going to lose any of my pieces. Okay, so now we've got that all stapled, we're ready to do some stitching. I'm going to use a blanket stitch and I'm going to stitch on the very inside edge of this cutout. Now I'm going to be using my Aurifil thread, which I spoke about earlier, and I'm going to use one of the brown threads. So I like to always use a thread that matches the colour of my wool. Now the reason I like to do that, I like the thread to blend into the wool, and I like the applique to become the feature. So now we're just going to tie a little quilter's knot. So that's just a matter of taking your cotton between your two fingers there and your needle, wrapping it around twice, holding the two together with those fingers and gently pulling it down. And that's going to give you a little knot in the end. So I'm just going to grab a stool to sit on to do this, because when I stitch, I find it very difficult to stitch just holding my piece in my hand like that. I always tend to rest on my knee or on a cushion. So I'm going to get comfy here on a stool and show you a bit of stitching. So I've got my length of thread and I'm using the size 11 milliner's needles, which are Sue Daly's needles. I like the milliners because they're flexible. You know, it's easy to get a really good chunk of the wool when you're stitching. And some people find them a little bit difficult to thread, and if so, I'd suggest you jump up to a 10 or a 9 even. The eye's just a little bit bigger. I'm just going to snip a little piece out of here. I can see that I haven't snipped right into that corner. It's not sitting quite well. So you can see, I'm just going to snip that little bit out just to sharpen that edge up. So I like to rest on my knee, as I said before. So what I'm going to do is start at this very point here. I'm going to come up from the back of my work. So we're going to come in right at the tip here. Pull it through. Left thumb is going to hold that thread out of the way. Take one stitch here. I always drag my thread over to the left-hand side. Thumb down, hold that thread out of the way. Then we're going to put a stitch in on about a 45-degree angle. Left thumb is still holding that thread out of the way. Release, left thumb down. I'm going to pop a little anchor stitch in here, just so those two don't move. Now sometimes I do that and sometimes I don't do that at that point, but we'll pop one in today. Doesn't really matter there. I'm going to talk to you a little bit later on when we're appliquing some leaves about those anchor stitches, because they're really handy when you're going around the tip of a leaf and berries, flowers with curves. Now see how that left thumb is really helping keep that thread out of the way. I use it a lot. Release, thumb down. So you don't want to pull your thread too tight when you're stitching, you really just want it to rest on top of your work. People do ask me, how do I get my stitches even? So the best way to help you is to perhaps imagine an 1/8 of an inch. Oops, just got caught around there. So an 1/8 of an inch between each stitch, or a little bit under an 1/8, and an 1/8 of an inch in length here. One thing I saw once was a lady had actually put a mark on her thumbnail 1/8 of an inch apart, and she used that as a guide. So she had a dark mark here on her thumbnail, and that would relate to this stitch here. Then she'd have another dark mark here on this thumbnail, and she'd use that as a marker as well. So you can see we're just about at the end. And what I'm doing also is tucking that little tail in too, just so that it's out of the way, but being really careful too not to stitch it in underneath. So tuck it out of the way so your thread doesn't get caught around it. So just about at the end. Oops, that stitch was a wee bit too small, but anyway. This last stitch that I'm going to pop in, I'm just going to pop it in at a 45-degree angle. So it forms like a little crow's foot there. Pull that bit out of the way. See there, we've got a 45-degree angle, then we've got our first stitch that we started with and our second stitch. So I call it a little crow's foot. So we'll take our needle back down through to the back, and we're going to tie off. Tug it in, turn it over. I just simply pick up a couple of threads with my needle. Again, whoops, got into a bit of a twist, and then loop my needle through. Now this is just the way I do it. You might be shown different ways by other people, but this is just the way I do it. Give it a bit of a tug, and then thread through just a wee little bit. Pull it out, and then we're going to snip off our thread. Now with the reverse applique, I always like to prepare these pieces before I position them onto my background. Especially if you're going to be going out sewing with some friends, you can have all of that prep work done and just take these elements with you in your sewing basket, and rather than drag along the whole project. So yeah, I tend to prepare these first. Now I'm going to remove the staples. Now it's really easy to remove these. So just pop it up, push up with this finger here. You'll see the top pops out. Bend it backwards, and we'll just pull out really easily. You can use a staple remover if you would like, but for me that's just another tool I'll probably misplace somewhere and wouldn't be able to find, so I just stick with my fingers. But see, yeah, really easy to pop out. The wool's self-healing, so the staples don't leave any marks in the wool. Somebody asked me once, would I staple if I was doing needle turn applique? No, I wouldn't. I would never staple cotton on cotton. So no marks left on the wool. If you had used a little bit of glue and stapled straight away, the glue was quite wet and you removed your staple and you did have a little dent, you just spritz it lightly with some water, and what you'll find is that the wool will just bounce back up. So we're stitched around the inside edge there. And now what we're going to do is trim away that cotton so there's none showing from the front. So we turn it over. We just gently release the cotton from the wool there. I think I can probably move around a bit so it's easier for you to see. So just gently lift it up, and just carefully we're going to trim. Now I tend to trim the bigger pieces that you can see from the front, just roughly, because once I have been known to actually snip off a whole section by trimming it the other way. So just really rough first. Then I turn it over and then I snip it, just enough so there's none showing from the front. Doesn't have to be neat because this is actually going to be positioned onto your background, so no one's going to see the back of it. Nearly done. So that's how it's going to look when you've trimmed it down. Okie dokes. All right, so now that we've prepared that section, we're going to go on to making up our master pattern so that we can start positioning all of our other pieces.